Good afternoon and welcome to the Making Star Wars panel. My name is Craig Miller and I'm co-chairman of this convention, but I'm also one of the people who worked at Lucasfilm on the various Star Wars movies, and we've all got all of the people here on this panel who we'll introduce in just a moment. We're all there at Lucasfilm in 76, 77, and thereafter working on the movies. We're going to talk a little bit about what it was like back then in the dark ages, before computers, before cell phones, working on these movies, and we'll tell a few stories, and depending on time, we'll answer some questions and go from there. So I'm going to ask each person to we'll start off with each person telling you a little bit about what they did at Lucasfilm, and also, how did you get your job there? So why don't we start with Chris Casady.
Hello, hello. Okay, I came right out of CalArts Film School and went straight into that job in Industrial Light and Magic. I had just a summer off or something, and I got that job because a friend of mine called me up one evening and said, if you come in tomorrow at 10:30 and ask for this job, you will probably get it. We're adding some staff. We have to accelerate production. I was brought in the last 6 months of production to head up the night shift in the animation department. I worked on laser beams and rotoscope mats. Upstairs at ILM, there was an animation department with 2 animation cameras, and we were putting in all those laser beams that you see in the dogfight sequences at the end of the film. The laser beams in the pistols, that the live action shooting, that was done at another place by another person, but all of the 8-perf animation was done in Industrial Light and Magic. And I made an awful lot of what are called garbage mats, which is drawing around the spaceship after it was shot on stage to mask out the light stands. And if you ever saw the VHS transfer of Star Wars, where you could see the mats through the starfield, that was my work you were looking at. They later cleaned up, but that's the one place my invisible work became visible. I was hired at $3 an hour, and when I left there, I had 4 different raises. I was kicked up to $11.75 an hour, and I was put in the Cameramen's Union, the International Cameramen's Union, which was a bit of a coup. So that was a real career boost to me from that job.
Okay. And I actually was officially hired after Star Wars came out, but I was involved from about a little less than a year before the movie came out as a consultant on the publicity of Star Wars, working with Charlie Lippincott, who was running publicity and licensing for what was then called the Star Wars Corporation, on getting Star Wars out to science fiction and comic book fans. And then the movie came out and I was hired on staff, where I had the title of Director of Fan Relations, but I was a publicist. I eventually ended up as a producer on projects like the robots on Sesame Street and a bunch of commercials and other things, and wrote a lot of different material and created and ran and wrote the official Star Wars fan club and all kinds of different things over the 3 years I was at Lucasfilm.
I was hired to
Say your name.
Miki Herman. I was hired to be George Lucas's assistant during in January of 1977, and the film was released in May of 1977. So we were pretty busy getting those shots out, and so I would follow him around, write down every word he said, and coordinate between the editorial, the special effects, the sound editing, and Yeah, so went to dailies, and then after the film was released, I was recruited by Charlie Lippincott in marketing and merchandising, and because I knew all of the props and costumes and actors, I took them all around to different public appearances, TV specials, photo shoots, documentaries, and I worked my way up. I worked on Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi. So after that, I produced ABC TV animation series on the Ewoks and the droids. So, and then after that, I retired and became a psychotherapist.
And just interestingly, my degrees, because I was in college when I became a consultant to Lucasfilm, my degrees, both of them are in psychology.
Oh, okay.
So I went the other direction.
Yeah.
So, Doug Barnett. My father had a little machine shop in the back of the house. My mother had to sweep the chips out of the kitchen. So I ended up a combat medic in the Army, unloaded boxcars for 2 years, built cameras for a place called Photosonics, and got fired. I think I was unionizing or something. They had something against me. In any case, they had a notice on the wall of unemployment for a NASA-type model builder. So I took a little model of a church into ILM a few times and convinced them they needed to hire me. And they hired me in Halloween of 1975. It's more or less a vacant building at that point. And we got to give kudos to Chris because nothing got made in the way of film until ILM hired him. We were just busy. At the first, we were trying to do front projection and the technology behind that, which was pretty well done by others, especially in 2001, but it failed. So they did a switcheroo and they went to optical printing, and everything got remanufactured or repositioned. And so then they hired Chris and the movie got made. And then after that, I did some contract work for Kerner Optical Company up in San Rafael for a few years. Built my own film studio, mostly did commercials on Ventura Boulevard, and built a couple of cameras for Ghostbusters and Metal Storm and stuff like that. And then bailed out, and now I run a Quaker Meeting House for 30 years.
I'm Mark Marshall. I was a punk 19-year-old kid from Oklahoma who, by some miracle, got accepted into a summer program at USC in the summer of 1977. We spent 2 days a week at Universal meeting with industry figures, and one of them happened to be Howard Kazanjian. And I bugged Howard after that meeting for every week for 8 months until he gave me a job as a film runner on More American Graffiti. Let me just say right now, there's a fine line between persistence and stalking. So I think I was just persistent. But after More American Graffiti was finished, I was asked if I wanted to stay on. And
More American Graffiti, they worked out of the same offices.
Yes.
Because it was a Lucasfilm project, so they were there in the building with us.
Absolutely. And so after that, I stayed with Lucasfilm and as a PA, but I owe a lot to Craig and to Sid Gannis, who gave me a chance to do actually a lot more than a PA would, including traveling to London with Craig to do the cast and crew interviews for the wasn't the press kit, it was the...
Well, we did the press kit,
Yeah.
but we did the fan club as
Right.
well. And
I got to write for the fan club, and so it was wonderful. And while I was there, I was hired as Steven Spielberg's projectionist at night, and a few years later became his personal assistant for 5 years. Spent 3 years with Dick Donner as a production rep, and then got into post-production, where I guess the last major thing I supervised was the first Harry Potter movie. So anyway, just I owe a lot to these guys. And I remember Miki, when we were in building 86, was it? On the Universal lot, you and Diana Elsis?
Yeah.
Yeah, in Gary Kurtz and George Lucas's office, and which was mecca for me because, after seeing Star Wars, I just wanted to meet George. So it kind of worked out well.
So how did you feel after meeting George? Was it
Kind of anticlimactic. In fact, I think the most that George and I ever said to each other was, "That was it."
That was pretty good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I got a wave, so that was
Yeah.
good.
Okay, so some of us talked about what we did after Star Wars, some of us didn't, but I wanted to talk about you guys, we've all been in the industry to some extent. Miki, you were through Jedi and then you got out of the industry
After I did the cartoon shows.
after the cartoon shows. But the world has changed. I asked Fawn Davis to be on this panel as well. Fawn didn't work on the original movies, but he was at ILM on the prequels. And I wanted to have him talk about the difference between what you guys were doing at ILM on the original movies and how they were doing it on the prequels. But how do you see things have changed? The differences in the way things are done. Do you guys work at all on CGI projects?
I worked on Star Trek the movie. It's sort of a dog and pony show, but we had a PDP-11 downstairs with huge discs, and we had an Evanston Sutherland vector-generated image machine that the Air Force had invented. And I don't think there's 3 shots in that film that we actually pulled off in almost a year. Computers were barely able to think for themselves, let alone for anyone else. So,
Let me tell you a story about a PDP-11. They're so sophisticated. About 15 years ago, a friend of mine salvaged one to use in his house as a heater.
yeah.
Because he's a computer professional, but they're so useless that they just generated so much heat. He just had it in the back of the house to heat up the room.
Hate to see his heating bill.
Well,
A little better than a doorstop.
I remember when they had John Whitney Jr., who his father was a very famous computer-type digital person.
Pioneer.
And so he did a test with an X-wing. They wanted to see, and this was early on, they wanted to see how it would work, and it didn't. It really didn't. It took so long. I mean, it might have been 200 years ago, the way the technology has changed. So
That was on which film? At what point?
that was, it must have been on Empire.
So early 80s.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, the original computers, because they had, they talk about the motion control system and it was computerized, but as Doug and Chris were talking about in Chris's slideshow yesterday, Chris took 250 3D slides at ILM while working on Star Wars, and we did a 3D slideshow here yesterday. I don't know how many of you saw it, but they were.
If you saw it, very good.
They were talking about, they're amazing slides, amazing slides. I was very pleased we were able to have you guys do that show. But anyway, they talked about the computers, which were hand-wired to do the motion tracking. But the reality is they really couldn't remember anything. So it would work that day, and then they'd have to try to figure out again the next day how they did those moves to make them match up, because that's how primitive computers were.
May I talk programming? I built a stock about this tall with about 12 potentiometers, and each one controlled a different memory of the computer. And so the cameraman would twist this knob a little bit, twist that knob a little bit, and twist this one, and go back and forth. It got a little warm in his hand. And then ask the machine to do it again, and do it again, and do it again, and maybe tweak the knob a little bit. That was programming.
Remember that thing.
Yeah,
Well, on the subject of computers, Doug, weren't there Tandy Radio Shack computers in the building, and how were they used?
I think we missed it by a couple of weeks on that. I mean,
There weren't any?
George bought one. No, you talk to Alpha J. Alpha J came down from Berkeley. That's something that has to be said, is Kubrick had done it with motors, just motors. But we had steppers from the aerospace industry. And so computers were actually effective to reproduce the moves. But the computers were really silly, stupid. Eventually, in that 3 years that they were poking along, from the time Alpha J thought of the thing and came down from Berkeley, till they moved up to Lucasland, what do they call it? Kerner Optical Company. The whole industry had changed. That's what you're talking about, a Tandy. By then, you could buy more in a Tandy than we started with by a leagues. There was a guy named Short, and I don't remember his first name now.
Jamie?
Jamie. He sat upstairs with a little rack full of computers and tried to build a follow focus for our main camera. Gave up. Couldn't do it. He's doing it on a teletype machine, paper tape. That's how he's programming follow focus. Follow focus. In other words, one of the elements that the knobs controlled was what your focus was, and we had no video takeoff. So the cameraman would have to do it by measurement, basically, and he was hoping to be able to measure the distance to the object. So the computer would actually think where it was supposed to be in focus, rather than that being one more channel that had to be programmed, which was really bogging everything down. Each channel took a lot of time.
As the camera changes distance to a person or an object, the focus changes. So you have to adjust the focus on the camera to keep the object in focus because of the difference in distance. So at that time, they did it by measuring the distance. And they would try to guess, when they're shooting like a pan or a truck shot or something, in that time, they would guess how much to turn the lens to keep something in focus as it moved closer or further away. So this was an attempt at mechanizing or computerizing that focus change.
For most of photography, it's a trivial number. If the distance between the lens and the film is 1/5 the distance to the model, that becomes a very important number to focus.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of filmmaking is, of course, technology. The technology in the 70s was different than the technology today in some ways, and in other ways, it's all the same. And a lot of stuff in the movie industry is practically prehistoric. You know, movie scripts are typed in courier type because that's how they've always been typed, and you can tell how much time a scene will take to shoot approximately because you know how much it is in courier type. But if you use a smaller type, a smaller font with different kerning and stuff, it changes. So they do it the same way, even though they don't really need to. We still have Apple boxes.
Yes.
You know what anyone know what an Apple box is? An Apple box used to be an actual wooden crate for moving apples. And if, you know, Alan Ladd was too short to be taller than the girl in the scene, he would stand on an apple box that they had stolen from somewhere. And they had half apple boxes, which were apple boxes cut in half when you only needed that much height difference. And sometimes it's because you needed a prop to be higher up or something. They still have things called apple boxes. None of them have been within 100 miles of an apple. They are manufactured for the purpose of raising things and people up in movie shots. But they're still called apple boxes because they've always been called apple boxes. You know, so there's a lot of the technology and technique of filmmaking that's the same as it was 100 years ago. And other things like computers. But they've also discovered, I think it's wonderful, even though all, you know, the special effects are all CG, they're still building miniatures. And they're using the miniatures for reference.
They're returning a little bit to miniatures, I
Well,
believe.
that's what I mean. That's what I mean. They're building miniatures again because they look better.
Peter Jackson has been spearheading
Yeah, I mean, a lot
traditional
of-
effects and
Yeah.
And the new Star Wars films, I think, are Force Awakens was more model-oriented. I know that Christopher Nolan, too, on Interstellar, insisted on miniatures. As he tried to do as little digital work as possible.
And a lot of times they'll build the miniature, shoot it from all angles, and then digitize that to do the special effects with it.
Yeah.
But they're still building
They're called
miniatures
maquettes
or
at that
building
point.
them again because it just looks better than creating it, building it inside a computer.
Yeah.
So some things that were done on Star Wars and for 100 years before Star Wars turned out to be the better way to do them.
Absolutely.
Yes,
I heard an interview with Rudy Scott. He was actually saying,
I'm sorry?
I saw an interview with Rudy Scott, and he was saying that you could do something mechanically that's actually a lot more expensive to CGI. Would that be one of the reasons to do it, if they're going back to the models?
I would think so. A reduced cost for actually building a real one than a CG one, because the CG stuff is really expensive. Yeah, you can cut corners. Was it Roman Coppola who did the effects for Dracula, Coppola's Dracula? And they tried to roll back a lot of this effect stuff and do a lot of in-the-camera stuff. He was resurrecting a lot of old effects techniques for that Dracula film by mirrors and half-surface mirrors and reflections and double exposures and things like that, kind of bringing back the old traditional effects. There's definitely been a backlash.
I think we need to touch on that. George Lucas came back from England after principal photography, and he looked at what we'd gotten done, which was zip, nothing, and in terms of images on plastic, and hired a few people and built up a studio where we would fly the X-Wings and the Y-Wings around on sticks with guys in velvet suits. And they actually started doing that. It eventually morphed into Joe Viscoso's explosions and everything when George became convinced that Robbie could actually do optical composites, and maybe there was a chance we'd make some kind of release after Christmas, I guess. Someday we'd actually finish the job, so they started doing explosions. But men in velvet suits with airplanes on sticks was almost where it ended up.
There's been some controversy. I have read online debates and controversy whether this ever really happened. You're one on record as saying that there was a moment when they considered men in black velvet suits and spaceships on sticks and stuff. I mean, how far did that get before?
I guess all I can say is that was the rumor in 1976.
Right.
Okay? So whether it's a real rumor today, I don't know.
Well, it continues to be a rumor. Are you saying that it actually happened? Are you aware of it actually happening?
No, I ended up on a different stage, Bevington, and
You heard about it, then?
yeah.
Can I jump in for
No,
a second?
please.
Yeah,
This
Miki.
is like getting to be technical, but I wanted to say that before I was hired to follow George around, they had just come back from England, and the associate producer at the time, Jim Nelson, said that they needed somebody to do second unit pickup shots. So that was me. I went to Death Valley, and we shot a lot of really cool things in Death Valley. We did the bantha with the elephant named Margie, who was dressed in this very exotic costume and with animal trainers, and she walked up the canyon, and that was really a thrilling experience. We did cantina scene pickups with the band and the monster masks and stuff like that in a studio in Hollywood. I got to read the lines with Han Solo with the Greedo, for the Greedo shot. George Lucas said, "This is your big chance, Mickey." And my line was, "Tell Greedo I've got the money." Tell Jabba, tell Jabba I've got the money. And so I wasn't cut out to be an actress, that's for sure. But those scenes are iconic.
Greedo was a female actress inside the Greedo costume.
Right.
You could have been Greedo.
I could have. I was once C-3PO, actually. In the C-3PO costume, we were in Death Valley for picking up a shot with the speeder. And it was supposed to be Luke and 3PO and R2D2 in the speeder. And so they put me in the 3PO costume because I was, about the same size as Anthony Daniels. And the speeder was an English car, and I couldn't see anything at all. So I worked the clutch and somebody else worked the steering wheel. I couldn't see where I was going. And the funny thing is that it's really a chore to get into the 3PO costume. I mean, it's just like they screw you in with these little
Oh, yeah,
minor
we
things.
would bring Tony in for things like when we did Sesame Street,
Yeah.
and I had to bring 2 people to dress Tony.
Well, the funny story is that I had to go to the bathroom. And I was the only lady on the crew, and we were like in the middle of nowhere. And so they're on the walkie-talkies saying that we have to take a break. And that was probably one of the most embarrassing experiences. But it ended up, my scene ended up on the editing room floor because it was a mismatch. And subsequently, they went back and they stuck Pete Coran in the C-3PO costume. And, we did things that were so ununion. George Lucas did not like unions, and because we were all young and none of us were in unions at the time. I never was in a union anyway. But so those are some funny stories. The live action shooting were some really genius things.
Yeah, I had the title Director of Fan Relations because if I had the title Publicist, they would have had to enroll me in the Publicist Guild.
Yeah.
Bob?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. Now, Mark Hamill was in the hospital because of the car wreck. One, do you remember what date that happened? And two, how soon did he get back to filming? Because I've read online, Peter Coran actually drove him out from Malibu
Right.
to the location where they were shooting the exterior of the land speeder show.
Mm-hmm. So that had to be, well, because I started in January, we probably did it in February, and he probably did it in March. We kept doing it till we got it right.
Yeah, because the first shots with Mark in the car in Death Valley, they only did the long shots with Mark because he wasn't recovered enough for close-ups.
He wasn't in the shot, there was a double
Right.
in the shot that I was in.
I think in the ones with Pete, they
They used Mark.
They used Mark in the long shots.
And that was over by San Bernardino, as I understand it.
Where did they shoot that?
Well,
Mojave?
yeah. My shot was in Death Valley, like around there. And so I'm not sure where they did the subsequent ones.
And you think that was March or something?
Could have been.
It was late. It's remarkable to think about how late they were still working on this film, based on when they released it.
Oh, yeah, it was
It was released
I
May
mean,
25th.
Well, we used Goldwyn, the mixing studio, as an editing room. I mean, Gary Kurtz was up there cutting the shots in, and the day that the film was released, I think it was still wet from the lab.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they were shooting, I think they were cutting at night at
Yeah.
Goldwyn because,
Marty Scorsese was
Yeah,
there in
they're-
the day.
right, they couldn't get stage space to do the editing because they had such a short deadline. So they were editing at night, and George was mixing sound past the release. Every version of Star Wars, it came out in mono, it came out in
Dolby.
Dolby Stereo, it came out in 6-track Dolby, and it came out in the 70 millimeter, which was its own 6-track Dolby. Each one of those had a different sound mix.
And here's an interesting thing. They would do this technique with the Dolby called worldizing. And this was invented by Walter Murch, who is a famous editor, sound editor and director and brilliant person. And they would take a sound and they would put a speaker in the room, in another room, so that they could re-record the sound. So it sounded like it wasn't recorded right there. They wanted it to sound like it was organic in the natural world. And Dolby was pretty new at the time, and we had a lot of trouble with it.
Yeah, but there's some arguments over different lines of dialogue in the movie, and some of that's because which version of the movie you saw, it's not that the sound was there or not there, it's if you saw it in the 2-track stereo, one sound pot was turned up, and in the 6-track, that pot may be turned down, so it was just louder or quieter. So different versions, you were hearing different things. So I forget now what it was people were arguing about. There was like some line of dialogue with rebel troops and stuff, being, whether someone said this or not. And it's 40 years, I don't remember anymore. But these arguments were going on. It's because it was always there. It's just which version you watched, whether or not you could hear it.
Didn't know that.
Well, 3PO's line about the tractor being where that was, that whole description was cut out. And then in the final version, it was just the shots of the graphics on the screen without 3PO's dialogue.
So the question becomes, what's a final version? George was pulling people in at 3 a.m. to do automatic dialogue replacement after it was in the theaters. And Disney replaced 2 shots between one release and the next, all in whatever, May of 1977.
Fox,
Fox.
not Disney.
I think Disney did the work, though.
Oh, is that right? So
Isn't that
Disney
what I-
sound?
No, we're not talking sound, I'm talking imagery that was improved, especially the land speeder
Didn't you
thing.
say they did 3 shots, Disney?
I think they did 3 shots in trade so they could wander through our place and measure everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's something that actually happened. This was after Star Wars came out, but leading up to it, they were very worried about whether the film would break even. And there were,
Is this a T-shirt story?
No, this isn't a T-shirt story. This is an ILM story.
Gotcha.
George, to help the film break even, this was before the film came out, obviously, George sold Fox ILM for $1 million against the recoupment on the film.
Wow.
And so for a very short time, Fox owned ILM, and George had a company that he called Magic Light Industries. ILM backwards, MLI. Then the film opened and made money, and they revised the deal. But there's a very short time, there was Magic Light Industries.
That's amazing. That was sort of George's way of paying for this in case it flopped.
Yeah,
They were going to
because he had, there was recoupment
take
required.
it out of his hide. Right?
Yeah, well, out of his money, not out of what he would get and whether or not he would get paid.
Confirm this rumor for me, Craig. I had heard that Lucas was sort of forced to bargain away some of his points to get things made or to get some budget overages. You ever heard that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not really privy to all the points of George's
I'm sure
personal
it's
deal,
very
but
private. Yeah.
there was a lot of points and stuff. I mean, the whole thing with the merchandising, part of George's deal was that he wanted the merchandising on it. Fox still got some of the merchandising money,
Excuse me.
and they controlled the actual contracts. Charlie Lippincott set all the deals, and then Mark Pevers, who was an attorney at Fox, wrote the contracts and made the deals. So the deals were actually with Fox. But George wanted control of the merchandising, and he wanted this huge percentage of the merchandising. And the guys at Fox were like, yeah, sure, give it to him. Because there was no money in merchandising before Star Wars. It was some that Star Trek got, but not much. And Disney made huge money on merchandising, but that was like, that's Disney and that's Mickey Mouse, and that was all. But merchandising was not a big business back then. That was thought of as little tiny money that you might get. Sure, give that director the merchandising rights, because that's worth nothing. Little did they know.
Can I ask Miki to explain something? How did Lucasland move from a doctor's office in Toluca Lake to the Edgemar Egg Warehouse?
Well, Howard Kazanjian's wife was a realtor, and I don't know what office you're talking about moving
He's
from.
actually talking about the
Riverside
offices
Drive.
we were in.
Oh, okay, so those were the marketing and publicity offices. We were at Universal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, George and Gary
bungalows.
and Mickey were in offices on the Universal lot, which George had gotten when he was doing American Graffiti.
Right, and the egg company was right across the street. And so that's where, we bought the egg company and totally renovated it in really good taste and made it a beautiful place. And now it's torn down and it's a BART station. Well, I guess they don't have BART
Yeah,
here.
as far as I
but-
can tell, the only Lucasfilm building still standing are those Riverside Drive doctor's offices that we were in. It was great, because everyone's office had a sink. Because everyone else in the building were actual doctors, and the building's still a medical building. We just got this one medical suite, and Charlie Lippincott was in the doctor's office, the one the doctor would go in, and he would meet with you to tell you you were dying, or whatever. And the rest of us were in exam rooms. And Mick Garris, who is now a very successful director, was our receptionist. And we were in there. George and Gary and Mickey were in the Universal office, which Howard was later in as well when they came over. And then we moved into what was called the Universal Motel, which was a big motel across the street from what used to be the Technicolor building at the north edge of Universal, that Universal bought and converted into office space. And we moved out of as the big company expanded with more and more people, we moved into offices in the motel. And then they kind of offered the guys who owned the Olsen Brothers egg farm, that was their shipping depot there on Lancashire. They just offered them so much money they were willing to move out. And then they started the remodeling. Two people, Angie Vasquez, who was our bookkeeper, and I moved into part of the egg building for a short time. And then they set up trailers in the parking lot of the egg building, and we all moved into the trailers.
And meanwhile, we all moved up to San Rafael. In 1978, ILM moved up to San Rafael, and so then we were building a whole new facility, and that was very nice. Most of the people came from ILM. Not everybody was interested, but most of the people, the principal people and talent in the camera department and mechanical department and stuff came. So the egg company was kind of independent from what we were doing at that time.
Right, well, it stayed the marketing and the licensing and the bookkeeping and the executive offices
Right.
were there. And when George was in LA, he worked out of the egg building. And then George told me that he was going to close up everything in LA and move everything up north, which is why I left Lucasfilm a week after we opened Empire, because I didn't want to move north. And I guess in early '81, was it, that they closed up the egg building, and those people that George wanted moved up north, and other people had to find a new job.
I'd like to put myself at risk for a second. As a leftist, I'm very concerned about war. And what happened when I was in the Army is I got my medical training as an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist in a brand new hospital called Letterman General. Eventually, after I left, the Army built the Center for Biological Warfare next to the Letterman General Hospital. And then eventually, Lucas Digital took over that spot. Can anybody illuminate that?
Never heard that, sir.
Yeah.
All right. Lucas Digital is on Presidio San Francisco Army Base. It's now a national park, and Lucas has a 99-year lease for that piece of real estate.
Presidio.
Specifically, Letterman General Hospital and the Western Research Facility.
Yeah, wow.
Letterman's been torn down completely.
It's all gone, yes.
Yeah. And as is the Universal Motel, those trailers, which of course were temporarily, and the Egg Building. And Mark tells me he thinks the building we had on the Universal lot is gone now, too.
I think so, based on, I'm just being in the area.
Mark's working on a project at Universal, so he was,
It's sad, really.
yeah. Well, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Yeah, and then we'll get back to you guys.
I'd like to know more about the state of mind of George Lucas in those last months leading up to, and then a little bit after.
Stressed, very stressed, and then he went to Hawaii.
I remember that trip to Hawaii, and people were talking about it as if that probably saved his life. That if he hadn't gone off to Hawaii, he was really on the verge of just breaking down.
When was that?
Well, that would have been right at the
release.
right at the release. That would have been April. I think he was off in.
Oh, the release was May 25th.
That's probably when he went to Hawaii.
Yeah.
Well,
Probably.
and he was there with Steven Spielberg, and that's where they submitted the deal for Raiders of the Lost Ark.
On that vacation.
Yes.
Okay.
I think they actually drew a contract in the sand.
Okay. Yeah. Because I remember hearing that George was on that vacation in Hawaii when he was starting to find out that the film was a success.
Well, actually, what happened was he and Marcia were having dinner at the, this is now a famous story. They were having dinner at the now no longer existing Hamburger Hamlet on Hollywood Boulevard across from the Chinese.
Oh, sure.
And according to George, he had forgotten that was opening night. Because there wasn't a premiere or anything. And they saw out the window, there was this big crowd, and they were wondering what was opening at the Chinese.
I thought they were at C.C. Brown,
C.C. Brown's ice cream.
the ice cream.
Yeah.
That's where they were.
Right next door. Or they were C.C. Brown's. Okay.
Well, I had heard it was the Hamlet, but in any case, and so they actually went and found out what was showing there and were amazed, but they were already planning to go to Hawaii that week. So they were there and they were getting the box office reports in Hawaii.
Wow. That's an amazing story.
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
What was the state of mind of you guys? You just finished 80-hour weeks for however long, and then you took, what, a bus trip down to Mexico or something to de-stress?
Lots of
You guys must
drugs,
have heard
lots
about all
of
the
liquor, what?
success, and how did that affect your minds?
Well, I was still busy doing all the foreign versions. I was still there, and then I had to check prints. That was really horrible.
I took all the props from the pickup shots for the cantina and the pickup shots for the... I took all that crap, Jim gave it to us, and we did a play over in Santa Monica called Endgame with Samuel Beckett, and I blew all my money from selling a 4-bedroom house and dumped it into a play called at the Odyssey Theater at the time.
Oh, I
So-
remember the Odyssey.
well, that was the other Odyssey, but yes.
Yeah, no, but I'm yeah.
In West LA?
Yeah.
So,
They've moved since then, but,
Yeah, we found things to do.
yeah, Mark and I weren't on staff yet, so.
Some of my friends in the animation department, including Doug, and about 4 others of us, and Robbie Blaylock from Opticals, we were exhilarated by what was happening with Star Wars. We got wind of a science fiction convention happening in Tucson, Arizona, called the World Science Fiction and Fantasy Convention. I think
No,
what's it called?
well,
Worldcon.
well,
World Fantasy and
Yeah.
Sci-Fi Con, something
No,
like
no.
that? World Fantasy
yeah, I don't, I
World,
haven't-
starts with World.
Well, it could have been World Fantasy. World Science Fiction Convention's never been in Tucson.
Okay, ever?
It
No?
was-
These are experts.
It was in, well, I was at the World Science Fiction Convention in Phoenix in 1978 representing Star Wars.
This is 77.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
So this
the
was,
Worldcon in 77 was in, I don't remember where it was in 77 now, but it wasn't in Tucson.
okay, well, we went to something in the,
I believe that part.
in the
It just
first
wasn't
of,
that.
it was the first week of June. And so Star Wars had been out 10 days, something like that, 2 weeks or something. And David Barry, Robbie Blaylock, Doug, Liz Ziegler, Pete, not Pete.
Pete flew in later with parts for the projector because the simplex projector quit.
Right. We piled in your van.
No, Robbie's van.
Robbie's
Rob rented
van,
that
Robbie's
van,
van,
yeah.
and drove to Tucson, which is a 2-day road trip. And this was our vacation. We were burnt. We were fried. We were out to lunch. We had been working on this thing so hard. Some people like Doug and Robbie and all for a couple straight years. And I remember that our intention was kind of to go there and see how famous we were. Or to see if we could get any attention. And I had made up little slides. I had cut up some dailies, some 8-perf daily, and put them in slide mounts, and I was hoping to sell them to fans. And most of the people there hadn't seen Star Wars. They didn't know what it was. We were actually too early. And they were there. Ray Harryhausen actually showed up at that convention with Charles Schneer, and they were there to see him and other stuff, and I don't know, Damnation Alley and Logan's Run and stuff like that.
Damnation Alley was the movie. Damnation Alley was the movie
The other
that
sci-fi.
Fox thought was going to
making.
be their big hit for the summer.
Yeah, Fox put money up for 2 sci-fi films that year. They put up $17 million for Damnation Alley and $9.5 million for Star Wars,
Yeah,
whatever it
eventually
became.
it was 10.5.
10.5.
But that was at the end. In
Yeah.
the beginning, it started at 7 something.
Yeah, but they thought Damnation Alley was going to be their big hit, so they didn't pay that much attention to. It's amazing what a little fringe movie Star Wars was when it was being made. There were just people weren't paying attention to it. There was a little bit of a dust up with the union when the union found out that ILM had switched from R&D to actually making shots for a movie, and if it's making shots for a movie, it had to be union. And I was hired right at this moment when the union was making noise saying, we've got to come in and examine what you're doing. We hear you're making a movie here, and you have to be IATSE registered. And this is a story that I'm just passing on that I heard that happened just before I got there, but that they had sent these union guys in, union cameramen mostly, I think, to see if they're the unemployed guys to pick up a job. They came into ILM and they saw this equipment, which we're making fun of now as being so antiquated, but it was absolutely state-of-the-art, cutting-edge, high technology at the time, and these union guys didn't know it, didn't want to be part of it, and once they saw what was going on, they said, screw it, we don't want this. We just want to do what we've always been doing, which is sit on this, load a magazine, hand it to the camera guy, have some coffee. This is what the union guys were. And there was a philosophy in this shop at ILM that I really appreciated being surrounded by, which was this young, idealistic, we can do anything kind of attitude, which flew in the face and cut through all that union stuff. We were like the guerrillas that were coming in, screw you guys, we're young, fast, and scientific, and we're gonna make movies a new way. And you have that kind of attitude, I think, when you're in your 20s at that age. And ILM was full of this kind of really neat, youthful spirit. I can only assume that trickled down from above. It certainly came from George and Gary Kurtz. Those guys deserve ultimate credit for, I think, the kind of psychology and the attitude about making movies for very little money with really good quality. And so there was a philosophy that I witnessed in the shop when I got there, that these people were really dedicated to doing really bitchin' work, really cool work. They really prided themselves on making really good models And everybody just had this really neat attitude. So they fed off each other. There was a little bit of playful competition. And it's what I think is responsible for the high level of quality in all these different departments and all these pieces.
I've got to say about Gary, who I worked with Gary on Star Wars and Empire and The Dark Crystal, Return to Oz, a bunch of other movies. We're still working on projects together. I'm in a different capacity now, but Gary, and I after I left Lucasfilm, I became a consultant on, I worked with Jim Henson, I worked for Disney, Warner's, Universal on a lot of the major genre movies of the 80s, and with a lot of different filmmakers. Gary has always been the most knowledgeable producer I have ever worked with in terms of how to actually make a movie. I worked with one producer who picked up a sheet of slides and turned them over to see it from the other angle. I mean,
But Kurtz knew film and mechanics and electronics. And he knew what he was asking for.
He knew all of that. And there were production meetings that Gary would be in on the movies I've been in, and people would come up with, how are we going to do this? And Gary would have an answer. Sometimes it didn't work, but he had an answer with the way, well, I mean, because you never know what's going to work. But, you know, he just had that kind of knowledge. He's just an amazingly talented filmmaker.
Let me ask you guys to speculate for a minute. What would happen if Star Wars had flopped?
Nothing.
What would well, I mean, would we have the CGI as soon as we did?
There'd be no Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank God. Oh, sorry.
There'd be no Battle Beyond the Stars, no Galaxina, none of those knockoffs. It'd be a very, very cool underground cult
would there be
film.
blockbuster summers? Would there be?
Well, yeah, there still would be, there might have been blockbusters,
Yeah,
because
there
remember,
would've been a feature.
Star Wars wasn't the first. Jaws was the first.
But it was kind of an anomaly at that point.
Yeah, but there were other we would have seen some other stuff come up. I think we would have had far less science fiction, because what people forget, those of us who are old remember this, but, you know, people today, I talk to all the time, today, every other movie that comes out is science fiction or superheroes, which are basically genre movies. The 70s, the late 70s, science fiction was not popular. The big movie, you know, 2001 was 1968. Silent Running was what, 72, 73?
And Logan's Run.
Yeah, and Logan's Run,
That's
which
about it,
was
right?
kind of a popcorn movie, but everything else was like Roger Corman and lesser quality and not thought of as a serious movie for real people.
There's another dynamic here, which is that Sony television that was coming in. It had excellent color. It was really tight on the image, and I think that Hollywood was terrified of the VCR and of the. I don't know if we had a VCR at that point, but it was real close. The deck we had reel to reel. Hollywood was pretty moribund before Star Wars busted it. And the presentation became very real, like it had been in the 50s and the early 60s.
You know, the whole thing with theaters changed because Star Wars, and it wasn't just Star Wars, but about that time, because it used to be theater owners, in the trade called exhibitors. What they really wanted you was to walk by the theater and throw your money through the door and keep on walking. They really didn't think highly of the people in theaters. Theaters were frequently dirty, the screens would be dirty, the sound would be bad. And right around that time, not just with Star Wars, but right around that time, you were getting certain filmmakers making demands. They wanted better quality in the theaters for their movies. Star Wars came out in 70 millimeter. There were very few 70 millimeter theaters. And what they found was that so many people wanted to see Star Wars in 70 millimeter, they would drive past 35 millimeter houses showing Star Wars to see it in 70. It became a good business model for a theater to install 70 millimeter projectors to play Star Wars and then end up with the 70 millimeter later because they made that much more showing Star Wars in 70. Theater owners really in that time, in the mid-70s on, started rethinking that they needed to have better presentation, better sound. That's how we ended up with Dolby Stereo and later THX and all of that, to make the customers happier, to make them want to come in and be in the theaters. It really was a change in attitude right around Star Wars. Yeah, Bob.
ILM had a couple of supervisors that are mentioned at President Hall. I was wondering if the panel could talk about Jim Nelson and George Mather. What were they like for everybody to work with?
Jim Nelson, he's the one that hired me. He was a great guy. He was really liked independent filmmaking. He was a veteran of sound editing. He worked on so many films that were great films in the 70s that actually were very good films. But he just sat at his desk and he counted every penny. That was it. He didn't really interact with people unless something happened bad that, he would go on the loudspeaker and he would threaten to cut somebody open with a Bowie knife. George Mather was an old timer, old friend of Jim's, and I don't know. I can't really say much about Mather. He showed up. Was he? I can't really speak about that.
Efficient.
I think so. I wouldn't know. I was in no position to really measure his work output and everything. But he's the one who hired me.
George Mather?
George Mather hired me.
Not Jim Nelson.
No. And this was probably before my time, but Nelson obviously was there from very, very early on, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
he set up ILM.
Yeah, so he goes back to the very beginning, Nelson.
July.
Mather was late, I believe, came in late. And as I understand it, again, I was also brought in late, and I was part of this hiring wave that was supposed to ratchet up production and get this damn thing done by the deadline. I was part of beefing things up. And I understood that Mather had preceded me not much earlier for the same purpose, and that he was sort of brought in to sort of be the hatchet man or the adult in the room a little bit. Sometimes you hear Gary Kurtz talking about what he called the hippie mentality at ILM, which is not untrue. And so my experience of Mather, that he was really sort of there to intimidate us a little bit, and to be the adult and to look after things, and particularly these late hires and the night crew and things like that, that it felt like Jim brought him on as an adjunct to him. And also Mather was the guy who had the ultimate chart. I think George Mather sat down and looked very seriously at the calendar and the shots and the calendar, and tried to fit the shots into you've got 200 shots to do, you've got 7 months left. That means so many shots per day. That means stage has got to put out 3 shots every day. That's, 2 for the day shift or something. So Mather, that's my memory, was that he was dishing out these assignments. Dennis Muren, you have to knock out 3 finished spaceship shots, per night if you're going to make this deadline. And so it seemed like we were sort of answering to him. He sort of intimidated us a little bit up in the animation department. That's how I felt about him.
George asked for $1 more than Dykstra was making. He got it. Dykstra would just sort of run down George in the hallways. He had no
George Mather.
George Lucas. He really had no sense of courtesy with George Lucas. And Lucas just despised that, because George is short, small, and Dykstra was tall, Jim was tall. So they hired George Mathers to just push on Dykstra, I think, and make the place work. And George would spend all his time sort of interviewing the janitor. He'd be there day or night. He had come from real low-budget stuff, so he really had this this idea that we didn't have to spend a dime more. I have to tell a story about Jim, and there's plenty of stories about Jim Nelson, but I flew to, at one point the optical printer failed, I think in April. It just blew up, and I called Alva J, who's the electronics guy, and I said, how do I fix this thing? And he said, well, you're not. I mean, I've got to get new transistors. So I got on the horn and found out where I could buy these transistors that Alpha J had named. And they said, oh, well, we'll get them here in a week or two. And I said, no, I need them now. So I actually flew to Phoenix, to Motorola, cut a deal with the distributor that I'd walk up to the guardhouse. They handed me the transistors, and I flew back that same day and handed them to Alpha J. And Jim Nelson kind of flew off the handle, because he used to hand me 3 blank checks with signatures, and I'd bring back the receipts. This was the limit, okay? Bringing back the receipts in this case didn't work for him. It washed. It was okay.
Wow.
This was April 76?
Yeah, real late in the game, but those printers were doing all the work.
Because some people get hung up on, you spent this much money, and not about, well, we saved the 2 weeks the printer wouldn't be working by,
Yeah.
getting the thing. So that's it. But Jim Nelson, now this is what I was told later. George Lucas blamed Jim Nelson for it taking as long as it did at ILM to get all the shots he wanted, without really any consideration to the R&D and all that going on. And there was a big falling out between George Lucas and Jim Nelson, who eventually took his name off the movie.
Credits.
Yeah, off the credits.
Period.
George Lucas took his name off?
Jim
Jim
Nelson.
Nelson.
Removed his
Jim
own
Nelson
name.
basically said, screw you, and had his name taken
Take
off.
my name off. I see, I didn't know that, yeah.
We just celebrated the 39th anniversary of the Star Wars Holiday Special. Ms. Herman, I'd like to hear your stories from the set of the Holiday Special.
Well, it was very interesting. It was very interesting getting the costumes made. I went around and I interviewed all of these special effects makeup artists, and I hired Stan Winston, who was really good, and he distributed the work with, among other makeup artists, Berman. It took several different studios to make those costumes. Originally, they were thinking they could just do the back of Chewbacca's head or something, which was unrealistic. And I don't really like talking much more about it because George really hated the results of it. So I heard the Steve Binder podcast that you did, and that was interesting. So I was there representing Lucasfilm, and Ben Burt was there with me, and the producers. It was just out of their league, and it wasn't a very good idea. The first few minutes of the film, of the show, they were just Wookiees grunting and stuff like that. And the finale and everything, it just didn't work. So I really don't like talking about it, but I do have a great respect for the makeup artists and the people that had to wear those costumes because they were not very comfortable. And the talent that they had. Originally, it was supposed to be people like Baryshnikov and Margaret, really mainstream people. And so that's about all I have to say about it.
If I can add a couple of things. I was at Lucasfilm during it. I was not actually working on it, although all the drafts of the script ended up getting sent to me as well. And it started out as an hour special, and that first hour, while not wonderful, was much stronger, but the network kept getting more and more excited about it being Star Wars, and had it changed to a 90-minute special and then a 2-hour special, and the material got weaker and weaker. And the other problem, and Mickey's right, that it really was out of the league of the people doing it, who were used to doing regular celebrity TV specials. And if you compare it to the kind of specials that were on in the 70s, it's really pretty typical of that material. Let's get all of the stars on our network to appear in this holiday special so we can sort of promote our other shows. And they tried to blend it into Star Wars, and it just didn't really work. But it's what those kinds of specials were. It just didn't work as a blend. So, and a lot of people said, oh, it'll be like a little Star Wars movie, but that's not what it was ever going to be. It was going to be entertainment, in quotes, stuff with a Star Wars theme. But yeah, it was a really bad idea to start with 20 minutes or however long of Wookiee language.
The producers came to Ben Burton and me, and they said, help us. I mean, they're no longer alive, so I don't want to say anything bad about them. They were very successful in their careers as variety show producers, but no, it was doomed from the beginning.
But that there's this kind of thing that people get into. I worked on The Dark Crystal, and the first version of The Dark Crystal, which none of you have ever seen, had all of the characters but Jen and Kira and Agra. Agra's the weird-looking character with the orrery. Those three were the only ones who spoke English. Every other character spoke a different made-up language. And I remember having discussions with Jim Henson about it, saying, people are not going to understand what's going on. And Jim was like, no, people will understand this. I said, Jim, your script's in English. You understand it because your script's in English. No one who doesn't have an English version is going to see it. So we set up a special screening of it with a recruited, demographically diverse audience, ran that version of the movie, and no one had a clue as to what was going on. They were just like completely mystified because you can't even get much facial expression from, as to attitude from the puppets. So after that, the result of that screening, Jim was like, okay, and then they redubbed the Skeksis and the Uru into English. The pod... What?
There were no subtitles?
No.
Oh, of course.
Yes, well, there were no subtitles. It was all in these weird languages. The pod people got left with their weird languages because, as I described them, they were basically friendly Romanian gypsies, and we really didn't need to know what they were saying. They were basically going around saying, hi, we're glad you're here, let's dance and eat. And that was their whole purpose in the story, so they could be saying whatever they were saying. But, so sometimes the people making these things get into the weird language thinking, oh, people will understand what's going on. And they're too close to it because their script is in English. The audience doesn't have that, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
And
And the Star Trek, the Klingon speaking Klingon with no subtitles?
Wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So may I pose a question? If Star Wars hadn't happened, what movies would George have made in the next 20 years, in those next 20 years? That's what I miss. What would Lucas have made as a movie?
Radioland Murders.
Howard the Duck slipped through that.
Well, a lot of the
Well,
success
I'll
of
get
Star
to you.
Wars was Marshal Lucas.
Yeah.
And she would, like George would cut things for the action sequences, and she would go in and recut it for the emotion. And so after Return of the Jedi, they were divorced, and then he made those other films.
Yes.
I hadn't heard that about Marshall, because that was my question, kind of, I guess you could say tie-in. Because I had watched an interview with Gary Kurtz, and I guess they had
I ended up staying at Gary Kurtz's house in San Anselmo for a couple nights during the film back in '76. And everything in that house related to the script. All the books that were open, everything in the safe, it was open. Everything in that house was part of building the image of what Star Wars became. So I would say he had a lot to do with it.
One of the reasons that Gary and George had split and Gary didn't end up doing Return of the Jedi was because of disagreements over the storyline. He had a very strong feeling as to the direction it should go. That was not the way George ended up doing it. And they, the exact percentage of how much is Gary, hard for any of us to say, but he certainly had input. Yes?
Did any of you have an involvement in soundtrack recording of Star Wars or Empire or Jedi or any stories about John Williams?
I remember I said to George, he hired John Williams, he said, based on his work on Jaws. And I said, well, that's, so that was that. And then I would go around with Ben Burt recording sound effects for different documentaries and things. Like we'd go out in the desert and find these guy wires and record sounds, and then he'd take them back to the studio. And part of the success of Star Wars is the characters that Ben's sound effects created. The characters, R2-D2, Chewbacca. That was all Ben Burt.
And the whole atmosphere of the place, all the background sounds and everything else was Ben. I mean, sound is incredibly important to it.
Mm-hmm.
And John's score is incredibly important to it. The funny thing, were you at that Oscar dinner party we had before the Oscars?
No, I was location scouting already.
Okay, there was a big dinner party, Oscar night, in '78. We'd taken over a restaurant, and it was just, for everyone to have dinner before the Oscars. Most of us were not going to the Oscars, but the whole company was invited to this party. And it was so weird because John was sitting we were in a regular restaurant, so there were booths. John was sitting in this booth by himself, and I did not know him because the score was recorded before I was hired. So I went over and sat down with him and talked to him about music and other movies he'd worked on and stuff, which was a really nice conversation. Then he, of course, went off to the Oscars and won.
Oh, I was at the Oscars in the green room, because I was in charge of the robots and the dancers and the costumes. That's why I wasn't at that dinner.
Yeah, I wasn't involved with operating the robots at that point. So that was you, and Mick Garris was one of the operators on R2 there.
Yeah.
My father was making documentaries or propaganda films in the World War II in London, and he always marveled at the ability of the English to produce a soundtrack, a musical soundtrack. They would watch the film once and just produce the soundtrack. So maybe it has something to do with England.
Yeah.
Well, Ben Burt cut music to the rough cut of different kinds of music that were fitting for the sequences. And when John Williams saw the rough cut, and with George Lucas's input, that was kind of how he got the idea of what he was going to
Right. Well,
compose.
I know George and Gary had a meeting with John about doing an old-fashioned orchestral score with, I'm forgetting the
London
music.
Symphony Orchestra.
Well, yes, with the London Symphony, but I mean the type of music to do that old-fashioned Eric Korngold kind of score, but with, I'm forgetting the musical term for it, but with each character having their own theme. I'm sorry?
Leitmotif?
Yeah, I guess a leitmotif. I'm not sure if that's the term I'm thinking of, but you know what I mean. Each character had their own musical theme, so when there was a scene about them, that was at least the underlying music that came up as part of that scene. So Ben's sound, that kind of concept, which is an old operatic, theatrical concept, all blended together to make an amazing audio package for the movies. But there's no way you can reduce the importance of Ben's contribution. He just, amazing amount of stuff he added to that film.
Where did they find Ben Burt?
USC.
Oh, good.
One of George's instructors there, Ken Mira, at USC, he introduced Ben Burt to George.
I know, Chris, you had brought a piece of the Death Star over there.
Should we look? Death Star. One of how many? Hundreds. Hundreds of these were made.
In 4 different sizes or 3 different sizes?
Yeah. Two different scales, I think. Mostly.
Yeah, and then they were fitted together at different orientations so that they would look different later on.
Yeah, you can already see that this is kind of collaged together. But in order to make, I don't know, several hundred square feet of this stuff, they made quite a lot of these. And then famously or infamously, these ended up in the ILM dumpster, most of which were hauled away to a landfill. And I think most people who worked there picked up 1 or 2 souvenirs on their way out the door at the end for souvenirs. So I have a few, and they've become sort of iconic. But Erland was talking recently. I talked to him. He mentioned that he's convinced that there is somewhere a landfill somewhere that if somebody could locate it or identify it, there would be thousands of these things.
Where?
He knows.
Yeah.
I'd love to have one.
The model shop was a little lost. They were building everything out of plexiglass and model parts, and then Lauren Peterson came in with this technology of silicone molds so they could get relief and urethane foam, and everything went crazy after that. So we have to give it to Lauren and his partner.
Was that his idea, to mold them and make multiples?
He brought that technology in.
Yeah.
Grant would have still been at it, I think.
Yeah, making them individual. Yeah.
It's fun if you can identify in the film that piece.
Well, it's blurred, I'm sure. It's streaked. Most all that stuff is.
Each piece was named after a part of the San Fernando Valley. Does anybody know the names?
No, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
Reseda and something like
Is
that.
that true?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah, I never heard that.
the Van Nuys block and the Sherman
Yeah.
Oaks block
Yeah,
and the
I
North
just-
Hollywood block.
But I can't tell
There was one they called the Kit Kat bars because it looked like that Hershey's candy.
True.
Right, the 4 things.
But those 4 pieces are 4 Valley locales.
Didn't know that. You learn
Must have
something
been a
40
Van
years
Nuys.
later, you still learn stuff. Still coming out.
Yeah.
There are other pieces from the films that you had borrowed 40 years ago?
Other than this?
Yeah.
Will
All
I
of
have
you?
Everybody has one.
I don't have
You don't have one?
No, I don't have one.
You came late. Mickey, you have one of these, don't you?
I sold mine on eBay.
You sold yours, so Mickey sold hers. Okay.
I built a factory to build electric limousines in 1994 or 5, and I sold a trash can full of stuff. We ended up with about 21 grand, which I flushed into the company and disappeared. I'm really good at getting rid of money.
They've only increased in value over the years.
Okay, well,
How
it
are we
is.
doing on time?
Well, it is now 5:25, so I guess we are
Over?
technically 10 minutes over. So thank you very much.